Testament this year. We're nearing the end. We hope that as you've opened up each new book, it's felt like this mini Christmas morning every time of new gifts that the Lord has to give to us if we'll just do these things that Clint's been talking about. Focus on Him, focus on our learners, stay trusting in the Scriptures. This is powerful as we open up this book today.
And I love your focus on getting people to focus on Christ and the learner. Great teachers do that. They focus on the needs of the people they're helping to invite to be more like Jesus Christ. I also like the word teacher. The word itself comes from a word that means to touch. That's what good teachers do. They touch people's hearts, their minds, enlighten them. And also it means to point out. A teacher is somebody who points to things and demonstrates. Good teachers aren't the focus. Good teachers should be windows to Jesus, or should be pointing people to Jesus. And any of us who have been called to be teachers, whether as parents or in the church in any way, our ultimate purpose is to be pointing and teaching and showing and demonstrating to other people who is Jesus, so that they can accept Him in their lives.
And we're going to watch Daniel do some of those very things today with the various kings that he's going to interact with and the people and the eunuchs in this particular story. So let's orient and frame Daniel in history really quickly. If you look at chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it." So Daniel is going to be a young man taken out of Jerusalem in that very first wave of exiles that we've already talked about in previous episodes. Look at the descriptors in verse 4. "Children in whom was no blemish, but well-favored, skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as has had ability in them to stand in the king's palace." So these are the youth that show the greatest promise, the top of their class, so to speak, out of Jerusalem, are being taken into Babylon, into the king's court. It's a very unique place in that culture.
Yeah, so what happens is in these ancient cultures, when they want to impose their culture on these conquered people, the idea is you get the best of the rising generation and you train them in your culture and in your learning. And part of the book of Daniel, and there's many amazing things to learn from here, but part of it is, how do you live in the world but not be of the world? How does Daniel both serve well within the place he's been appointed while also maintaining his identity as a believer and follower of God? So these Babylonians, and later you see it with the Persians, they're also having to grapple with, how do we work with people who may not have our religious values? And we see one of the major outcomes in this story is that Daniel and others who were willing to accept the good that the society they were in offered them, while also standing true in what they knew to be true and good, it caused these leaders and many people in their society to acknowledge the God of heaven and to recognize who He was. So it's interesting, this interplay, because if you think about, for most of the Israelite history, they've been in their land, the land that God promised to Abraham and his posterity. Well, what happens when you are no longer in the promised land? How do you maintain your fidelity to God, your sense of identity? And Daniel's this interesting model that it's okay, you can accept and make use of the good that the world has to offer while also maintaining your true identity as a child of God and as a witness for His love.
So we see the first test of Daniel and these three friends of his, that their Hebrew names are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Their names get changed to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which is how you're probably familiar with them. They're Babylonian names, or Aramaic is the. And we should probably just take a moment here and make this very clear. The Jewish people in Jerusalem are speaking Hebrew, which is a related language. It's in the language family with Aramaic, which is the main language in Babylon of the huge empire. So Hebrew is like this dialect of this bigger dominant language, Aramaic. Well, that language is going to permeate that culture for 600 years. So when Jesus is born, he isn't raised speaking Hebrew. He's raised speaking Aramaic. This is the language that Jesus would have known. So the king is taking these Hebrews and he's teaching them the language, and he's feeding them his food. He's raising them in his court. And the first real test comes in verse 5. The king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank. So he's giving them the fineries, the delicacies of his table, to prepare them to grow up to become better servants of him. And if he's feeding them meats and delicacies from his table, you can guarantee many of them would not fit the Judaic law of Moses with their food prohibitions, their form of the word of wisdom. And so you get verse 8 says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the princes of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself." He's saying, I don't want to eat that food. I'm not going to defile myself. Well, the guy in charge here, he's nervous. He's saying, well, I'm going to lose my head if after a short period of time you're not as strong as all these others. I'm going to be the one held accountable. Did you notice back in verse 5 it said that the people who are gathered are people who understand science? So isn't it fascinating that in verse 12, Daniel invokes this scientific method, right? He says, "Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink." Pulse it's something that is sown. So it's like vegetables, grains, fruits of the field. Give us those and give us water to drink instead of the king's wine. And after 10 days, let's do a science experiment here. Prove this. If our countenance is fallen, if we're not as strong, then we'll stand corrected.
And what happens? So he consented. And I love them. I mean, these Babylonians are not dumb people. They're like, okay, let's give that a shot. We can run a test. So he consented to them in this matter and proved them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which should eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink and gave them pulse. So Daniel, again, is making it clear, I can participate in the society, but I also can stand firm in my convictions. And I also have to say, I appreciate that the Babylonians were willing to accommodate the religious needs of Daniel at this particular point. Now, we'll see other stories where initially they didn't. And when we live in a large global society where there's different people of different viewpoints and opinions, there's this interaction of like, at what point, what do we accept from other cultures that is good? And what do we say, I am not going to accept that because that crosses boundaries for what God has revealed in my life. So we see these interesting stories that we don't see these as much in, say, the narratives of First and Second Kings. Although I guess you do get the Canaanites and the people worshiping Baal. And so, again, we live in a society where this is valuable today, where we don't have to completely reject the world entirely. Like, we all fought a war in heaven to come to this world and to be tested and tried, like Daniel. And I love that we get this message from Daniel that we can know what's true and stand firm, and we can appreciate people in our culture who perhaps may not accept all of our values, but they're willing to accommodate and support us in the things that we care about. And I'll just share just a brief story about this. I grew up in Minnesota. There were not a lot of members of the church. And growing up in high school, I loved the fact I had early morning seminary. I had really dedicated teachers, young men's leaders, bishops, and other leaders that encouraged me to understand the gospel. And as I was getting older in high school, and things would happen where I'd have to declare my values, at first I was a little nervous about it. I thought, are my friends going to reject me? And I feel deeply grateful for my friends. None who ever joined the church were so respectful of me. They actually thought I was cool. I became a cool kid in high school because of the values that I clearly stood for. And I learned, like Daniel, that I can accept the truth and I don't have to compromise my values by living in society. And I can have lots of friends from lots of different walks of life. And I've actually written letters to my friends telling them, I so appreciate the maturity you had as a teenager that you were willing to accept me as I was. I hope when I get, when I grow up, I can be more like you, that I can be accepting of other people who might think differently than me. And I don't want to force them to change, but I can love them where they're at. And that's what they did for me.
It's powerful. It's a powerful example. So let's jump to the conclusion of this particular story in verse 17. As for these 4 children, what happened to them? It says, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. It reminds me of one of the promises contained in Doctrine and Covenants, section 89, our modern word of wisdom, that it's not just to keep your body healthy and strong and full of energy and vitality. It goes beyond that. Listen to section 89, verse 19. They shall find wisdom and great treasures of knowledge, even hidden treasures. I see it all as connected to God's commandments given to us regarding what we should and shouldn't do, what we should and shouldn't eat, how we should take care of our physical bodies, this wonderful gift that God has given to our spirits for our mortal journey.
It ties into what Clint talked about earlier, that Joseph Smith, seeking to be more like Jesus, was in the scriptures and reads in James about seeking wisdom, that God is the source of wisdom. We see that happening here. This is a fulfillment of James 5, although it happens centuries before, that if we do what God commands, we will experience wisdom and knowledge in our lives. So I invite you to think to yourself, when in my life have I lived a particular command, and what wisdom or knowledge did I gain? Or maybe you say to yourself, I'm going to actually run a test this week. Maybe I'll give myself 10 days like I saw Daniel did. And I'm going to try some particular commandment that maybe I've struggled with. And give it 10 days. And do you gain more wisdom and knowledge? Do you find yourself drawing closer to Jesus Christ because you have run that 10-day test? Be a scientist with the gospel. Test the principles of the gospel. Prove God that he's teaching the truth, that the things that he's revealed will help you to find more joy and peace and happiness and to draw closer to him.